Thank you, Ben, and welcome to everyone this evening. For those of you who've never visited us, the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens is a collection-based research and educational institution in Greater Los Angeles. It was established 101 years ago by Henry E. Huntington and his wife Arabella for the advancement of learning, the arts and sciences, and to promote the public welfare. Today, the Huntington is home to 16 themed gardens with 16,000 plant species. We like to call them our living collections, which are spread across 120 wondrous acres. Our museum houses 42,000 works of mostly American and European art from the 15th century to the recent past. Mr. Huntington was one of the leading book and manuscript collectors of his day, and the library has grown since his time to some 11 million items, dating from the 11th century to the present. In this period of COVID-19, our grounds are now open to the public by advanced ticketing. And if you wish to visit us, please do consult the website, www.huntington.org. However, our library and art museum spaces remain closed according to state and county guidelines. There was the belief expressed soon after its establishment that the Huntington would bring people to San Marino and Los Angeles from all over the world. Well, if we can't bring the people to the Huntington, then we must bring the Huntington to the people. And through technology never envisioned a century ago, it's now possible for us to share our totally unique collections with a wider circle of people from around the globe. We're pleased tonight to inaugurate this online series, Curatorial Dialogues, Collections at the Huntington, designed to bring together two curators to speak about very different works from the collections and their divergences and points of intersection. I'm delighted to be joined by my curatorial colleagues, Dr. Vanessa Wilkie and Li Wei Yang, two of our 14 library curators responsible for collection development and interpretation. Vanessa is the William A. Moffett Curator of Medieval Manuscripts and British History at the Huntington, curating the library's renowned collections in those areas. She earned her PhD in British history from the University of California at Riverside and came to the Huntington in 2013. Her research focuses on aristocratic mother-daughter relationships in early modern England, and she has published on female editorial practices and death rituals. Vanessa has curated 2 library exhibitions, Magna Carta, Law and Legend, and the Reformation, from the Word to the World. Li Wei Yang has curated the Huntington's Pacific Rim collections since 2015. Prior to that, he was an assistant curator of Western American history and institutional archivist at the library. He holds a Master of Science in History from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and his MLIS from San Jose State University. In 2015, Li Wei curated the Huntington's first exhibition on Chinese American history, Y.C. Hong, Advocate for Chinese American Inclusion. He is currently preparing an exhibition printed in 1085 on the Huntington's oldest printed book, Fascicle 45 of the Huayan Jing Chinese Buddhist Canon. Vanessa's curatorial area reflects Mr. Huntington's foundational interest in the culture and history of English-speaking peoples. She will discuss one of the library's most storied treasures, the 15th century prayer book that many believe Mary Queen of Scots carried to her execution. Mr. Huntington, a New Yorker, looked back in time across the Atlantic, but he also saw the future across the nation in Los Angeles and chose to locate his library here. The Pacific Rim collections that Li Wei curates constitute a recently configured curatorial area that is a natural outgrowth of the Huntington's collection, California and the American West, and a direct response to contemporary interest in migration, ethnicities, and the transnational aspect of individuals and communities located around the Pacific. Li Wei will speak this evening about a recently acquired set of Japanese scrolls documenting Matthew C. Perry's maritime incursion into Japan. Vanessa and Li Wei will each present for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, and then there'll be a discussion, and then there'll be time for your questions. So Vanessa, please do begin.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My story tonight begins with two queens, Mary Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland and Queen of France, and Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England. Henry VII was Mary's great-grandfather, and he was Elizabeth's grandfather. So they were essentially cousins. But this generational gap isn't really what matters. Here is what matters. Henry VIII was Elizabeth's father, and in his will, he stipulated that if Elizabeth were to die without heirs, the English throne would pass to Mary Stuart, next in line of succession. There wasn't a united Britain at this time. England and Scotland were independent kingdoms. This terrified Elizabeth for many reasons, in part because Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth was Protestant. In 1568, Mary may or may not have been involved in a plot to kill her husband, which is another story for another day. She was arrested in Scotland, but fled to England, where she was taken into custody and then abdicated the Scottish throne to her Protestant son. There was an inquiry in England about all of this, but Elizabeth was reluctant to act one way or another. So Mary was held captive in England for 19 years. In the 1570s and 80s, Mary was implicated in two separate plots to dethrone Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's Privy Council finally convinced her that she had to take action. Mary was put on trial for treason and found guilty. On February 8th, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringham Castle in Northamptonshire. Eyewitness accounts tell us that she carried a crucifix and a prayer book with her. She demonstrated staunch Catholic devotional piety on the scaffold and shouted out prayers in Latin as the minister's Protestant prayers were read in English. Her execution became legendary. And in 1613, an unknown Dutch artist captured a lot of the details, including this pink prayer book with two clasps. Most scholars agree that this is the manuscript book that Mary carried with her on the scaffold, Huntington manuscript, or HM 1200. It's a book of hours made in Flanders in the mid-15th century, and the binding was put on in the 16th century. Inside, the text is written in two different sizes of Gothic bookhand, and the manuscript contains 11 full-page miniatures done by an anonymous Flemish illuminator, but in the style of the Masters Gilbert de Metz and the Master of the Privileges of Ghent. But we know that these miniatures were not originally intended for this book because the other side of the page is blank. And if you look closely, you can see that the borders here between the two pages don't match. The text is written in iron gall ink, and the colors were done in mineral and organic pigments. It's believed that Pope Pius V sent this book to Mary while she was captive in England. He is the same Pope who excommunicated Elizabeth. After Mary's execution, the prayer book went back to the royal family in Scotland, and ultimately it went to Scots College in Paris. After the French Revolution, the manuscript went back to the UK, where it was then sold to American collectors. In 1917, George Smith acquired it at the Bixby sale, and in 1918, Henry Huntington acquired the manuscript. So how do we know this is the book? On one of the front flyleaves, written in a late 17th century hand, it reads, "This book belonged to Queen Mary of Scotland, and she used it at her death upon the scaffold." Then at the bottom of that same page, written in a 19th century hand, it says, "The above the handwriting of King James II." Mary Queen of Scots was King James II's great-grandmother. And this writing is so faded, it's now only visible under ultraviolet light. Andrea Knowlton, the former senior book conservator at the Huntington and I, started working on this project in 2015. The cover is done in pink silk velvet, but almost all of the nape of the velvet has been lost, and the silk velvet threads are weak and fragile. All 5 supports of the book have split. The board, the front board, is being held on by deteriorating silk. The parchment hinges have also split, and only a fragment of the tail cap remains. There's also a heavy layer of glue that was applied along the back of the manuscript over the sewing supports, and the adhesive has hardened and darkened over the centuries, making the book incredibly brittle. As a result, this manuscript has a very tight opening, limited to about 10 to 20 degrees. Andrea Knowlton built this custom cradle for the manuscript, and in this photograph, we are testing it out with a modern book, not with the manuscript itself. You can see here that the cradle is made in 3 pieces. There's a flat board at the bottom with 2 adjustable wings that make up the cradle. And if you look along the bottom, you can see that the adjustable segments are less than 1 centimeter apart on both sides, which allow us maximum control over the opening and continuous support for the volume at any angle. The pictures that you see online when you look at the manuscript were taken in the late 1990s, and only some of the pages were photographed. So we're missing images of a lot of them. They were actually made at a very narrow angle and then digitally retouched and digitally stitched together so that it looks like the book was laying flat when it was photographed. This should be a reminder that you can't always trust the pictures that you see online. Every time the volume is touched, we risk deterioration. The velvet continues to break down and the spinal threads weaken and continue to break down. When both of these things happen, the cover will come off and new materials will have to be introduced to put them back on. This will permanently alter the book as an object. Because we cannot safely open the manuscript volume as it is, we grapple with an ethical question. Do we value this manuscript as a text or as an artifact? If we value it as a text more, we say the content matters the most. We think about the prayers and the miniatures and their liturgical and artistic significance. We think about the history of reading and devotional piety and what this manuscript can tell us about Mary Queen of Scots' own reading and piety practices. If, however, we decide this is an artifact more than a text, we're saying that the form and the structure matter the most, and we'd be reluctant to add new materials. After all, this volume played a vital role in an important historical event. If the materials were stable, it could easily be both. But because they are not stable, we face hard choices. For guidance, I think about what the Huntington values. The Huntington is a collections-based research and educational institution serving scholars and diverse audiences. Because the Huntington is both a library and a museum, we are uniquely suited to grapple with this question because we already think holistically about our holdings as both sources of content and artifacts of cultural heritage. So this ethical question then gives way to another question. Can advances in imaging and computer science allow HM 1200 to remain both a text and an artifact? My colleagues and I believe they can. So in an effort to seek solutions, we keep a close eye on innovations, like multispectral imaging. And here the example that we use is the Archimedes palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that was written on and then erased and then written on again, where you can see both forms of the writing with certain kind of imaging. in this case. So here, a team from the Walters Museum in Stanford used multispectral imaging to try and answer the question, can we read the text that was erased? And with this imaging, you can. Multispectral imaging uses numerous digital photographs taken at different wavelengths and then layered on top of each other to enhance a specific area. And this allows us, through these digital technologies, to see the text that was erased as well as the text that remains on the page. This is fascinating, but with HM1200, we're not trying to see text that's obscured. We're trying to see through a book that can't be opened. So we look to CT scans, and the Brienne collection in The Hague is a great example of this. The Brienne collection is a postmaster's trunk of 2,600 letters that were written between the late 17th and early 18th century. And 600 of those letters were never opened. So with CT scanning, the idea is, can we read letters without breaking their seals? This piques my curiosity because I'm asking the question, can I read a book without opening the covers? CT scans also take layers of photographs by doing a 3D picture of a very small object and using X-rays and then layering them together. And by doing this, the iron gall ink of the letters is revealed through the X-rays, and you can start to see some of the letter shapes on this image on the screen. So this seems very promising. CT scans could potentially show us a text of a book without opening the book. But while a CT scan can show color, that color is artificial. CT scans use reflective dyes that illuminate in different colors. And the red in the image that you're looking at here was actually added digitally after the image was made. Because of the artistic significance of HM1200, we need the colors that we see to be accurate. So what about PCT scans? And here we're looking at papyrus rolls that survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. These rolls are made of papyrus, and the text that's written on them is done in charcoal, not iron gall. PCT scans is a different kind of X-ray technique that also does a 3D image of the roll, and then it can distinguish between the charcoal and the papyrus. Basically, very basically what people do is take through the scans and through the X-rays, they take little snippets of the images, and then scholars work to piece it together like a giant jigsaw puzzle until the images and the words make sense, and then they can read the text. So this project is also grappling with fragility. But again, they're not dealing with artistic renderings of color. So how do we achieve our goals? Maybe we need a flat, narrow lens that can be inserted into the narrow openings of a book. Maybe we need microscopic cameras that can fit into a tight gutter. Maybe we need something completely different. I once had a conversation with someone at Microsoft who proposed the idea of building a framework of mirrors around this cradle to capture different images and then digitally reconstruct those. This 15th century manuscript is a historical artifact. It has a relationship between these miniatures and the texts that need to be studied. It teaches historians about Catholic worship in Protestant England, and it can reveal devotional insights into Mary Queen of Scots in her final days. But could this manuscript also potentially lead to innovations in imaging and digital reconstruction technology? This manuscript is at the intersection between the arts, humanities, and STEM fields. And manuscripts like this remind us that sometimes we need the tools of the present, maybe even the future, to help make sense of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And now Li Wei.
Thank you, Claudia. So whenever the anniversary hits around the years, thousands of Japanese will gather across Japan to commemorate the 1853 arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships. As one of the most famous American historical figures in Japan today, Commodore Perry's landing on Japanese shores on July 14, 1853, triggered a national crisis and prompted Japan's Tokugawa governments to undertake drastic reforms. Japan's feudal and agricultural-based society would eventually reinvent itself into an economic and military powerhouse that would challenge the United States on multiple fronts. Today, I present to you 3 expertly made scrolls by unknown Japanese artisans that give a chronological overview of the Perry expedition from the Japanese perspective. It's difficult to say exactly how many Japanese scrolls on Perry are extant today. During the 19th century, Japan's largest cities contained a large number of commercial artists whose job was to record news through illustration. And most of them ended up as print shops where they were transformed into cheap, sensational newspapers for sale. But far fewer are the ones where artists who were commissioned by Japanese nobility for record keeping. So this collection contains 1 manuscript scroll made in 1853 after Perry's first expedition, and 2 additional scrolls made after 1854, after Perry's second and final expedition to Japan. And the longest scroll in this collection measures more than 22 feet long and contains a combination of drawing, of calligraphy, and government reports. The 3 scrolls that we are learning about today were likely made for Japanese nobility. Widely regarded as the American who played a lead role in the opening of Japan to the West, Commodore Matthew C. Perry was almost 60 years old before he took command of the East India Squadron. Initially, Perry thought the Japan mission was not befitting for a senior naval officer like himself. Perry's expedition to Japan in 1853 and 54 were not the first. In as early as 1835, 1845, 1849, and 1851, the federal governments had attempted to negotiate with Japan, but without success. In one instance, a Japanese samurai actually pushed down an American naval officer for not following Japanese etiquettes. The main American objectives at the time were to establish diplomatic relations, such as by forming embassies, to ensure that American interests in Japan were protected, such as the issue of caring for shipwrecked sailors or the refueling of American ships in Japan, and to ultimately establish access for American products to go into Japan. This is in line with the United States' overall expansionist policy in the Pacific, which concerns commercial and industrial expansion, the advancements of communication technology such as railroad, telegraph, steamships, etc., and scientific surveys and exploration. When Commodore Perry received his orders in 1852, his first task was to correspond with booksellers across the United States and gather anything that he can on Japan. He then assembled a list of American industrial and craftsman examples to be given as gift to the Emperor of Japan. But most importantly, Perry purchased navigational charts of Japanese waters from the Dutch governments, the only Western countries at the time to have limited commercial representation in Japan. However, Perry was determined to not repeat the Dutch experience in Japan. From 1640 to 1853, Japan was a closed country to most of the world, and Holland was the only Western nation to have limited trade privilege with Japan. And as a result, the great majority of Western knowledge that were transmitted into Japan was through the Dutch language. And this unique system was called Rangaku, or the Dutch studies. And a small group of Rangaku scholars in Japan focused mostly on the practical aspects of Dutch studies, such as medicine, botany, pharmaceutical science, and astronomy. Dutch studies became a quite unique specialization in Japan, where most Western scientific knowledge imported into the country was filtered through the Dutch language. As a result, a small elite group of scholars and translators devoted their lives in studying the Dutch language at the expense of learning other European languages. During the coast country era, Japan was still doing a fair amount of trading internationally, mostly through China, through Korea, the Ryukyu Kingdom, and the Dutch East India Company. As the only Western representative, the Dutch traders were confined to a small, bespoke artificial island called Dejima in the Bay of Nagasaki. This was done to make sure that the Dutch traders had a place to stay in Japan while minimizing their interaction with the ordinary Japanese citizens. The 2-acre island was under strict control by Japanese authorities at all times, and the traders were not allowed to go into Nagasaki without approval. Moreover, every few years, the Dutch merchants were required to make an expensive trip to Tokyo to kowtow and pay tribute to Japanese leaders. This illustration of Dejima from 1670 is one of the oldest European prints of the artificial island. It is an English reimpression made from the Dutch first edition in 1669. I should point out that the Huntington has a rich collections of rare books focusing on European and later American exploration and conquest in the Asia-Pacific region. On November 24th, 1852, Perry boarded the USS Mississippi and departed from Norfolk, Virginia, and made his way to Madeira, through Cape Town to Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Okinawa, before going to Japan on July 2nd, 1853. On July 7th, when the squadron was about 70 miles off Tokyo, Perry's ships were spotted by Japanese fishermen. The first Japanese boat to get close to the American ships was one that carried several artists who sketched their impressions of the Americans and their warships. It is likely that the scrolls that we are looking at today were at least partly based on what the artisans and the artists recorded at the time. This illustration showcases Perry's path through the Ulaga channels into Edo Bay. You can see Edo or Tokyo all the way to the right, and you can also see the various defensive positions maintained by Japanese governors. Perry's chosen path into Tokyo is not ideal in a military sense. He is anchoring on Japanese waters and surrounded by defensive positions. But in Perry's mind, he is simply setting the stage. And that is by showing off his superior warships on Edo Bay, which stretches to about 40 miles long. And he is asserting de facto control of the Japanese territorial water. And so this manipulation of the setting caused a huge panic, not only within the Japanese government, but also within the city. Perry's calculated display of superiority is reflected in the Japanese portrait of the admiral, which is on your right, and vice admiral, which is to your left. While the vice admiral is identified as Henry Adams, the portrait of the admiral is not named or identified, even though it is Perry. This is also apparent in many other Japanese Perry documents I have seen. Not all of them, but they're consistent enough that a few of them are always took the fashion of not naming Perry. So this could be interpreted as a sign of respect to Perry, or that during the early stages of negotiation, Perry was this mysterious American figure who delegated behind closed doors. The theatrical aspect of Perry's mission extended beyond the warship demonstrations, and the skillful presentation of American manner, American appearance, proved to be an important asset in controlling the setting to Perry's advantage. During his first expedition to Japan, he presented himself as important, as demanding, by refusing to meet the initial group of low-ranking Japanese officials who came on board to meet him. Perry projected himself to be on almost on equal footing as the Emperor of Japan, and he actively avoided any dealing with the lower strata of Japanese democracy. In early stages of meeting with the Japanese, Perry secluded himself in his cabin and delegated his chief of staff, Henry Adams, to receive Japanese officials. When they suggested the Americans should sail to Nagasaki and stay with the Dutch traders, Perry threatened that he would land American troops on Japanese land and march to Edo to see the emperor. The Japanese relented and decided that they were going to send 2 governors appointed by the Tokugawa authority to deal with him. On February 13, 1854, the American return to Edo Bay was more than 1,600 sailors. This show of force was obviously calculated to intimidate the Tokugawa government. But Perry also brought along a number of engineers, scientists, and artists to showcase American technologies and culture. Japanese officials who were acquainted with Dutch studies were not unfamiliar with the technologies behind the American gift, but they were still a big hit with the Japanese public. The villagers crowded around the gift-giving ceremony and were later even invited to participate in them. James Morrow, an American doctor who was appointed as the botanist for the expedition, wrote extensively about his encounter with ordinary Japanese in his diary. There was also a reduced size locomotive train that was designed to run 350 feet around a circular track. An American engineer had to feed the coal furnace while directing the direction of the train. The Japanese were impressed with the railroad demonstrations as officials and samurai took turns riding on the small train. Little did the Japanese know that in 1871, the nation would be constructing its first railroad, not far from where Perry first landed in Japan. And today, Japan is actually a major exporter of high-speed train technology around the world. The telegraph was another technical innovation that delighted the Japanese. While Rangaku scholar Sakuma Shozan had already constructed Japan's first telegraph line in 1849, the American telegraph demonstration still delighted the villagers who gathered to see it. The demonstration involved setting two telegraph devices about 400 feet apart while transmitting messages back and forth. And some of the villagers actually raced and to try to beat the telegraphy transmission. This is another reminder that Dutch studies in Japan was limited to the upper crust of Japanese society. Perry and his crew did well to impress and intimidate the Japanese through their cannons, to their negotiation tactics, military display, and the gifts showcasing Western industrialization. After the exchange, the two sides negotiated and signed the first treaty between the US and Japan. The legacy that Perry left is indelible. While it is difficult to gauge the collective historical consciousness of a nation, most Japanese people you talk to today will at least partly attribute Japan's rapid industrialization to Perry's incursion that ended almost 800 years of feudalism. But historians have also argued that Perry's maneuver left a deep scar on the Japanese consciousness, and this helped inspire the Japanese to look for their own prey, namely the colonization of Taiwan and later Korea, starting in the late 19th century. When Japan surrendered during World War II, the American flag that Perry had brought to Japan was flown during the surrender ceremony. In a way, it is as if Perry himself had presided over Japan's two biggest defeats to the United States. Since 2015, the Huntington has placed emphasis on Japanese American history as part of the Pacific Rim collections. We have acquired early Japanese newspapers that reflect the arrival of Americans and Europeans in Japan in the mid-19th century. We have also acquired the business records of George Turner Marsh, an early dealer in Japanese art based in San Francisco. There are also the papers of Arthur Ito and the Sakai Kozawa family, two of the earliest Japanese American flower growers here in the LA area, starting in the early 20th century. Since forming any comprehensive research and archival collections will take years of careful stewardship and decisive acquisitions, I will continue to focus heavily on adding new Japanese and Japanese American materials into the collection. The addition of the Japanese scrolls on Commodore Matthew Perry has greatly enhanced the Huntington's holdings on Japanese and American history. Not only do they cover the beginning of US-Japan relations from the Japanese point of view, they also established the scope for future collecting. After all, it was after Perry's incursion into Japan that the government started to formally allow Japanese citizens to emigrate internationally. It was after Perry and subsequent treaties that art dealers like George Turner Marsh and other Americans were allowed to live and work in Japan. Along with the Huntington's 109-year-old Japanese garden, the soon-to-be added 321-year-old Yokoi house from Marugame, Japan, at the library's location here in the LA metropolitan area, which is home to one of the largest Japanese diasporas in the world. The acquisitions of these Japanese scrolls has added invaluable voices to one of the most important geopolitical events on the Pacific Rim in the 19th century. Thank you.
So thank you, Li Wei and Vanessa, and you join me now, and I'm just struck by physically these are such very different items. One is a set of scrolls and one is a codex manuscript, a complicated codex manuscript, as you've told us. Yet there are similarities in both. They use text and image to convey meaning. And as artifacts with presentation and commission histories, they're loaded with another type of meaning. Can you comment any further? And maybe Li Wei, you should go first, since you didn't comment as extensively on the artifactual aspects of the scrolls.
Yes, so the use of text and image to convey meaning is even more important when it comes to the scrolls. So obviously this is the mid-19th century and photography was just starting to come into place. And the Japanese actually had a few cameras imported from the Dutch at the time. But it never really was put into wide use. And so when it comes to illustration and manuscript, that was really the main way for the Japanese to record what was happening. And for the Japanese artisans, there's really no context for them to base on. You know, this was a national emergency that was happening at the time. You know, these Americans just showed up with these big battleships, you know, with the black smoke, and then sort of, you know, very menacing looking. And so they had to record whatever, you know, they thought it was interesting, whatever that the government required them to do. And these scrolls were eventually, you know, was most likely made for a Japanese nobility. And eventually these scrolls were passed on to the Japanese governors in other parts of Japan who were not able to witness the American incursion at the time, and for them to understand the situation. And the scroll themselves, you know, is interesting because we don't know how many of them are there, but we do know that there are a few examples, you know, both in Japan and in the United States within the university archives as well too. And so there's definitely a lot of, I think, even though they're two very different documents that we're talking about with Vanessa today, but then I think there is the transnational aspect of these two documents, and there's a lot of unknown about these two documents that we're still trying to figure out.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I completely agree with Li Wei in that these are manuscripts, both of them, that are pretty well studied. They're incidents, historical moments that are really well studied, but they do both, because they are significant artifacts, they do open up a lot of room for questions and for transnational questions. With Mary Queen of Scots prayer book, you know, Claudia, you originally said that these are materials that are loaded with meaning, and the fact that the Pope who excommunicated Queen Elizabeth sent a prayer book, allegedly, we think, sent a prayer book to Mary Queen of Scots while she was a captive, that is a loaded meaning. And using a book to send a really powerful religious and political message to monarchs in Europe in the 16th century. The religious component of the prayer book as an artifact is also really important. When you look at that Dutch watercolor or Dutch rendering from 1613, you see different vignettes from the execution scene. And one of the things that you see is that after Mary's execution, her body was actually stripped and her clothes were burned because they didn't want to create any relics. Mary would have been a Catholic martyr. And so they didn't want to create any relics from any of her any of her belongings. But as a prayer book with these illuminations and these liturgical texts inside, this was not something that would have been burned, and was something that was, you know, became a relic unto its own right, and then went back to Scotland after the fact. So people, even at the time of Mary's execution, thought of this as kind of as a European artifact, as an important European artifact.
So cultural exchange and collision are important aspects of both of these works. You know, the prayer book was made in Flanders, written in Latin for a Scottish queen who spoke French and was queen consort of France. And the scrolls map Japanese land and show American figures and technology. And, you know, political and religious struggles are embodied in both of these works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the prayer book is really a portal to the European Reformation in so many ways. So it has this life as a medieval manuscript, and it was first produced in the 15th century and can speak to the artistry and the book trade in the 15th century. But then it takes on this other life as it moves across Europe and then moves to the British Isles in the midst of this great political and holy schism So exchange and collision is exactly kind of intellectually and spiritually and emotionally mapped onto this manuscript.
I think for the scrolls, I think this is definitely a clash between the Atlantic and the Pacific. You remember when Perry took on this mission, they did not travel from San Francisco or the West Coast of the United States. They traveled from the East Coast through Africa, through India, through Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Japan in 8 months. And so, and Japan at the time too was trying really hard to keep out these Westerners trying to open Japan to foreign trade. Besides the Americans, there were the Russians, the French, the British, who were trying to open Japan up to international trade as well too. And so to the Americans, I think this was part of their manifest destiny, when it comes to the expansion of territory and trade routes of the West, that also extend into the Pacific Ocean as well too. And during this time, Japan was trying its best to keep out Western influence coming into the country, and then to also keep its citizen within Japan as well too. So immigration at the time was mostly not possible for Japanese citizens to go out. So they know very little about these Americans. And so this was quite a surprise when Perry showed up at the door with such a show of force. And so Perry was very effective in getting the Japanese to sign an unequal treaty that benefited the United States mostly.
I think that's so interestingly way to think about is, as you just said, that, thinking about the international scope of these collections, like when you first look at the scrolls, you think, oh, they're Japanese scrolls and they tell about America. And when you first look at the prayer book, you think about Flanders or you think about Mary Queen of Scots. But then when you just articulated the route that they took and the story that's told as a result of that, you really do, when you start to think about the pass through objects, you start to see so many different people's stories and so many different geographies that you don't necessarily think of when you look at something on the surface, a text or a manuscript on the surface.
Yeah, and both of these works are part of this 11 million item library. And, I positioned your collecting areas as representing 2 poles of Huntington collecting. But can the scrolls and the prayer book be linked by other materials in the library? Do they hook up with other things that unite them?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the story that Li Wei originally, started with is in many ways a Reformation story. The Dutch and the Portuguese that first go to Japan during the Reformation. European politics play out internationally because of these collisions. And then, so that story from a European perspective is represented across the Huntington's collection in both early manuscript and early printed prayer books, liturgical texts, politics and imperialism, absolutely. We have in the 19th century, in the period that Li Wei's talking about, the Hammond collection, which is a 19th century manuscript collection about naval administration in the British Pacific Station in Central and South America. So there is this big scope of history from British imperial and European imperial perspectives across the collection that can easily link maybe not easily, but intellectually link these 2 things together.
Yeah, I think we can find a lot of common grounds between my curatorial area and Vanessa's. So through our, very large and very impressive rare book collections, a lot of them contain these conquests and exploration of the Pacific Asia region by Europeans and later by Americans as well too. So just a few examples, we have the first Latin edition of Marco Polo's travel to China here at the Huntington. And there are also, rare books, whether in Italian or in French, containing the first mention of tea in Europe as well too, or containing the first printed Chinese characters within a European book as well too. If we want to move over to 19th century, we have, these amazing photographs from John Thompson, taken in China in the 1870s. These were some of the earliest photographs ever taken of China and the Formosa region as well too. And not to mention, James Cook's expedition to the Pacific. These are just some of our collections that can relate to both my and Vanessa's areas.
Okay. So, you're both extremely knowledgeable about these materials and the areas you curate. So what are the questions that are still to be answered by scholars? That's why we hold these materials, because people are always asking new questions, and we can't answer all of them. What are the opportunities for inquiry and for innovation?
So I'll go first. So for me, I want to find out why there are sort of similar versions of these scrolls existing in a lot of places in Japan. So my guess is because they were being made for different governors throughout Japan, and because these are not printed, because when it comes to the early sensational newspapers, those are not considered maybe expensive looking and not fine enough for the nobility in Japan. And so they commissioned these artists, and so they made these similar but ultimately different manuscripts in a number of copies, and they were sent to Japan, to different parts of Japan, kept by the family. And whenever fortunes do change, the family were forced to sell off these scrolls to collectors, whether inside or outside Japan. And that's why the transmission of these scrolls are everywhere today nowadays. And so I'm more interested in who these artists were in making these scrolls at a time, and what were their sort of mission when it comes to why do they choose to depict certain element but not the others as well too.
Yeah, I think for the prayer book, certainly there's so many different lenses that you can bring to something that moves through time and space this way. So from the standpoint of medieval manuscript studies, in art history, I think we need to do more work on the relationship between these singleton leaves of the miniatures that were bound into the book in the 16th century in comparison with the texts that are kind of original to that text. So we need to do more research about the relationship between this as a visual medium, but then also it talks about do more about the study of the book network and manuscript networks in continental and wider Europe. And then from a British history standpoint, this book doesn't show up in Britain until the later half of the 16th century. And this tells us about the history of reading in Renaissance England, the history of Catholic piety in in Reformation England. But I also think, again, not thinking from the manuscript studies or historical perspective, but from the curatorial perspective, I think this manuscript really does open up conversations about new techniques in imaging and computer science and how we digitize our collections and what we can do beyond taking vibrant, robust pictures of our pages. So digital humanities can be enhanced by manuscripts like this as well.
Li Wei?
I mean, I'm inspired by Vanessa's presentation. Maybe I should run a few of my books and manuscripts through some kind of scanning machine, X-ray machine, just to find what sort of hidden things are in my collections. But at least for my scrolls, they are not that they're not fragile in the sense that they're being damaged. So I think there might have been some conservation work done to them. So they're fairly sturdy. The only problem is that they are long. We're talking about 22 feet. And so opening up the scroll and then viewing the scroll is actually quite a difficult test for us. So you have to find a table space that can accommodate the length of the scroll, and you have to open up carefully in order not to damage them as well too, and then to put them back in their original shape. But we definitely have conservations here who took a look at the scroll and determined that whether they're safe enough for our researchers to come into the Huntington and look at them too. But we're also looking forward to digitizing these so that we can make them available to the wider research community.
It's never a simple answer with special collections, I guess.
Yeah, and the Huntington is at this moment ramping up its digitization efforts to make more materials available to the public and scholars all around the world. We have all learned the value of the internet, but I'm going to some of the questions, and we have a lot of questions, and I'll try to pull some of them together. And one person does make point that, of course, a manuscript is three-dimensional, even the vellum, the pigments on it. So how can you really capture that? And maybe Vanessa, you can agree with that and then just comment a little further.
No, I completely agree with that. In fact, early on when, in 2015, when Andrea Knowlton and I started this conversation about let's revisit this manuscript and see what can be done with it, there was a meeting that we had with some staff in the conservation lab and John Sullivan, who is the head of imaging services. We set the manuscript in the middle of the table because none of us wanted to touch it. And obviously it was on a board and set in the middle of the table. And then the first thing that John Sullivan said is, I can make a 3D scan of the exterior, with 3D printing to make a replica of the exterior of the book so that you could think about the materiality of her holding the book and how she carried the book and how she used it almost as like a prop, which was really cool and interesting to think about. But then it opened up this whole conversation of the fact that you are the person who asked the question is exactly right. All of this imaging and technology is never going to replace the object itself. And so you're never going to be able to capture that subtle undulation of the parchment that happens over time, the texturing that you start to pay close attention to with the brushwork and the strokes of the illuminations. So nothing can really take the place of that. But what we can do with digital images is allow people who are interested in the text to have access to that without necessarily needing to handle a manuscript that is already vulnerable and fragile. So it allows us to hopefully responsibly extend the life of the manuscript as an artifact that way.
Yeah, and so I have a question now, thanks Vanessa, for Li Wei, and I'm gonna roll two in together. Why do you think the Japanese used the scroll format to present the Perry visit? And were the depictions of Perry and his second in command intended to be accurate or to portray these persons in an unfavorable or favorable light?
So I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. So I have seen a lot of these Perry depiction in other scrolls. And so I think compared to others, this one is not trying to portray them. This one is trying to stick to realism. It's trying to depict the Americans as accurate as they can in this particular version. Because if you've seen other versions, a lot of them just border on, cartoonish, on caricature, and so, but I think for this particular version, you see that, the railroad, demonstrations, you see the telegraph machines, is trying to present this authentic accounts of what was happening. And so I think, and was the portrait of the Americans too, because the Japanese for the longest time have always thought the Americans, always having, blonde hair, blue eyes, and they're hairy. They're referred to as the barbarians from the South as well too. And so there's already a lot of preconceived notion about Americans coming in. And so this surprise visit by Perry and his crew really put a lot of strain on these Japanese artists who come into, who are, sort of put into the situation and trying to record the situation and for their Japanese governors elsewhere in Japan. Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, why did they pick the scroll format?
I think because these were designed for Japanese governors. They were, again, at the time there was a lot of these cheap newspapers that was created really fast. They were using woodblock prints and they were sold cheaply on the streets. Those were not the kind of things that, these artists are looking for. They were using scroll because printing was really not out of the question, because printing, to do fine printing, it requires a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, and they have limited amount of time. And so that's why they were committed. It's often faster to commission, basically people to go and write down and draw what was happening. And the scroll was able to accommodate these, a lot of elements that was taking place at a time. And the scroll itself also, I think, it also conveys a sense of that this is an important document that was going to go to Japanese governors throughout Japan.
Okay. This one is for Vanessa. do scholars believe it's possible that Mary signed her name, indicated ownership? A number of people have asked about marginalia in the book. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So Mary did not sign her name in this book. Many of her other books that have survived from her library have her coat of arms and her initials on the binding of them. This one does not because it's velvet cover. But other owners who held the book over the 16th, 17th, the late 17th, early 17th, 18th, 19th century did leave ownership signatures inside the book. There is no marginalia in this manuscript. The cradle that I showed you that Andrea Knowlton made, we have a researcher at the Huntington who was interested in this very question about Mary's reading practices and marginalia. And it took us a couple of years to develop a way that we felt was safe to do it. But we did end up with the cradle that Andrea designed, and we went through, kept the book at about an 18-degree opening and went through every single leaf looking for marginalia, and there was none in there.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to close. People have asked about DNA. What would DNA tell us for either of you?
Well, we do periodically at the Huntington DNA testing on our parchment manuscripts. We work with the University of York. They send out kits to museums, and our conservators, you take samples. It looks like a little eraser, and you erase parts of the parchment throughout the manuscript in different areas to get a good sample, and you put them in little vials and you send them off to York, and they do their data analysis. We have not done that with this manuscript, and DNA testing would tell us what skins the animal was that gave the parchment, or they made the skin. They made the parchment from the skins of a particular animal, but we have not done that with this manuscript because it's too fragile. I know people have also asked in the past about whether or not we could retrieve Mary, Queen of Scots DNA from the manuscript, and I don't believe that would be possible. Our conservators and I had to talk about that in the past too. Just the manuscript, human DNA that transfers from holding a book to the object itself, it doesn't last in that way on a manuscript. So we wouldn't be able to recover any DNA from someone holding the book, but we can do DNA analysis on the animal that the parchment is made from.
Yeah, and to conclude, Li Wei, not DNA, but thoughts about how to identify the recipient of these scrolls. And people have asked about, one person has used the black ship scrolls in teaching that are published. And so these different varieties, if that's a way in the types of depictions to figure out who they would have gone to, the artists.
So at the time, it wasn't, for these kind of documents, usually the artists and artisans don't include their names. So we're already lost on the information on the author. But when it comes to the recipients, a lot of time we can tell by the attached government reports. So I wasn't able to show in this presentation, but these scrolls actually include government reports that included a number of important Japanese politicians, the number of soldiers that they command, because the Japanese were essentially preparing for war to get ready for the Americans to invade. So they wanted a survey of their own forces and see how much they can come up with. Unfortunately for this set, we don't have a definitive name of the recipient. So that's what I keep telling you. It's probably for a Japanese nobility, for a daimyo, for a Japanese feudal lord. But in other documents that we own about Japanese perspective on Perry, we do have identification of the various regional governors that was in receipt of these amazing reports. And so it's really up to going into the content and just trying to read through the names and see if you can find anything that you recognize.
Well, thank you both, Vanessa and Li Wei, for your wonderful presentations and for discussing the correspondences between these two items and answering questions from the audience. And I guess this concludes our program. We're a minute or two over. And before we sign off, I'd like to give special thanks to our colleagues in education and public programs, Ely Wood and Joy Harding, for organizing this event. And of course, always to our audiovisual production manager, Ben Tuttle, voice of the Huntington. You're our Don Pardo. We are in LA and we hope we don't lose you to the networks. Thank you and good evening. We appreciate your sharing the hour with us, all of you in the audience. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you all.